Good morning, and thank you all for joining us. I especially want to welcome our students who are here. Is this the senior class from Herndon, Virginia, do I understand? Welcome to our Science and Technology Subcommittee hearing, and we're glad you're all here. This is our first, make yourself at home. We'll fit these kids in so they can see a little bit of this hearing because it's on a topic that I think is of great importance to their future. I'm particularly pleased to be able to chair this subcommittee and excited to be able to work with Mr. Inglis, who's a good friend and with whom I've had the privilege of traveling to look at some of the effects of climate change. By the way, Bob, my take, and you'll hear this a lot in this committee this year, is I'm no longer going to refer to what we're talking about as climate change because it's actually, in my judgment, lethal overheating of the planet and acidification of our oceans. You'll hear this a lot from me, but climate change sounds nice. Change we can believe in, just helped elect a president, and global warming sounds like a good thing. We like to be warm, but I hate to be overheated, and acidification of the ocean is actually also happening. I raised that. Actually, we have the sad news that apparently a rocket malfunction with carrying a carbon-observing satellite caused that satellite to go into the ocean instead of into space earlier this morning. It's a big setback for us scientifically. The other side, maybe the satellite knows something we don't, and it realizes that part of the carbon problem is in the ocean, and we need to spend more attention there. That's looking on the bright side. Of course, it'll be worthless to us there. But this is an important hearing, and it's going to give us an opportunity to examine the quality of the information being collected on the emission of greenhouse gases. A number of states have established programs to address climate change, lethal overheating, and to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions. Over 130 nations will meet in Copenhagen, Denmark, this coming December. This is an incredibly important meeting to negotiate a new agreement to control greenhouse gas emissions. Members of the U.S. House of Representatives and the Senate have stated their intention to develop legislation to regulate greenhouse gases, and the Environmental Protection Agency is planning to release a Federal Register notice soon to establish a mandatory greenhouse gas reporting system. However, in order to evaluate programs, either mandatory or voluntary, for controlling greenhouse gases, we must be able to track emissions accurately. We need an accurate measure of baseline emissions. We need to know the emission levels we're starting from, and we need a good baseline estimate as a benchmark to determine whether control programs are effective or not in reducing emissions. We have experience and technologies to monitor emissions from utilities that we gained through the Acid Rain program under Title IV of the Clean Air Act. However, there are many more entities that need to be monitored under a greenhouse ocean acidification gas control program, and some of these organizations have to initiate new programs to track emissions accurately. If we're going to develop a program to control greenhouse and ocean acidification gas emissions, we need to start developing tools that will enable regulated entities to track their emissions using methods that are accurate and that are not overly burdensome. We have an excellent panel of witnesses today here to tell us about how this could work. All three, or all of our witnesses bring extraordinary expertise. I look forward to their testimony and to the recommendations on how we can ensure the information on greenhouse and ocean acidification gas emissions provides a reliable measure of emission source and of the effectiveness of policies we may put in place to control the emissions. With that, I would recognize my friend and colleague, Mr. Inglis, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, let me congratulate you on having the gavel in this committee. For those of you who don't know, Dr. Brian Baird is really quite an expert on the topics that he was just speaking about, and has taught me a great deal. And I think it really is a great thing to have you in the chair, and we look forward to working with you in a collaborative fashion. You know, my view is that compromise is not really what we want. That's a zero-sum game where somebody has won and somebody else has papered over a loss. Collaboration is where you draw the strengths from both parties and you figure out how to use those strengths to produce something better than either party acting alone could produce. And so that's the spirit that I think that Chairman Baird brings to this committee, and one that I also want to make evident here. And so I'm excited about this first hearing in this committee, because I'm hoping that the panel, Mr. Chairman, is going to help with a an idea that we're working on in my office that I've mentioned to you. It has to do with a revenue-neutral carbon tax as perhaps a better idea than a cap-and-trade system. Two problems with cap-and-trade. One, it's a massive tax increase. Second, it has the vicissitudes of the prices of the credits going up and down, traded by Wall Street traders. Gee, I don't think that sounds too good in today's environment. But a revenue-neutral carbon tax, transparent, so that we can see what the tax is, and it is revenue-neutral, which starts with an equal and offsetting tax reduction. The payroll tax means that technology then has a source of funding. You reduce the payroll tax and impose a price on carbon, and now people have money in their pocket to afford the new technology and to drive into the energy market the kind of transformational change that we saw with the internet and the PC. What Microsoft and Apple did for the internet and the PC, I think the revenue neutral carbon tax can do for energy. It can make it so that entrepreneurs and inventors get married at a certain point on that line of that transparent carbon tax, because there'll be clear price signals as to when they should marry and when they should take out the incumbent technology. So the reason this hearing is relevant to that is that we're also trying to figure out a way to make that so that it does not punish American manufacturing. And the key to that is perhaps a WTO compliant, and we're struggling to get it WTO compliant, but I think we can get there, border adjustment, so that when products come in from overseas, we're happy to have them. It's just that we want to apply the same tax that we've applied domestically to those imported goods. And one of the key challenges there is figuring out how do you make that fair adjustment. And if you can tell me some scientific way that we can judge the carbon output, or I should say carbon input into those products that are being imported, then, and particularly if it's something mathematical, some easy way of doing that. Of course, that easy part may be a little bit difficult, but if there was some way to project what is the carbon footprint of imported goods, and then apply it equally to domestically or produced goods, so that then you really are looking at the spirit of WTO compliance, and perhaps we can work it into a technical compliance as well with WTO rules. So I'm excited about this hearing because I'm hoping that you have some insights into that and how this monitoring might, the measuring devices that you're talking about may help us as we try to figure out a way to measure the carbon footprint of goods produced and imported here. It's a key part of this revenue neutral carbon tax concept. It's also one of the more complicated parts of it, because the last thing we want is to have American manufacturing subject to this and say the developing world exempt from it. That results simply in the export of American manufacturing capacity, and that's why Kyoto failed 96-0 in the U.S. Senate. So we can improve on that if we collaborate, and I'm happy to be next to my friend Dr. Baird here on the committee, and hope that we can collaborate and look forward to learning from this panel today, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Inglis, for your comments. If there are other members of the committee who want to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. And at this point, I'd like to introduce our witnesses. Mr. John Stephenson is the Director of Natural Resources and Environment at the Government Accountability Office. Ms. Jill Gravender is the Vice President for Policy at the Climate Registry. Ms. Leslie Wong is the Director of Greenhouse Gas Programs at Waste Management Incorporated. And Mr. Rob Ellis is the Greenhouse Gas Program Manager at Advanced Waste Management Systems Incorporated. As our witnesses know, you'll each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing And when you've all completed your spoken testimony, we'll begin with questions. Each member of the panel here will have 5 minutes to question. And we appreciate, again, your presence here and look forward to your input. We'll start with Mr. Stephenson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and other members of the subcommittee. I'm here today to talk about the importance of developing reliable emissions data for carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. In other words, we must know how many tons of such gases are actually released into the atmosphere by power plants, industrial facilities, and thousands of other emitting sources, and be able to measure the changes in those emissions over time before we can successfully institute any market-based mitigation scheme such as cap and trade or the tax program we just heard about that would create a price for all 6 primary greenhouse gases: carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide, methane, and the 3 synthetic gases. It's important to note that the data needs, whether emissions on a facility-specific basis or emissions on an economy-wide basis, depend on the point at which the program regulates emissions. That is, whether the program attempts to regulate a small number of upstream emitters, such as fossil fuel producers and importers, or instead a much larger number of downstream emitters, such as individual industrial facilities. For example, an upstream program for carbon dioxide would likely regulate fewer than 3,000 sources and cover virtually all carbon dioxide emissions from fossil fuels, whereas a downstream program would regulate about 10,000 large emitters like power plants and cover only about half of the total carbon emissions. In general, the challenges in establishing baseline emissions data, as well as in monitoring, reporting, and verifying those emissions over time, will increase as the number of regulated entities, activities, and greenhouse gases increase. Upstream programs would generally have less complex data requirements than downstream programs. The U.S. has economy-wide fuel use data which could be used for an upstream program, but this would not be suitable for a facility-level emissions data needed for a downstream program. The U.S. also has facility-specific data for carbon dioxide emissions, as you mentioned, for coal-fired power plants, but such data is not available for other greenhouse gases or other industry sectors. Experiences with existing cap-and-trade programs demonstrate the criticality of quality emissions data. For example, the U.S. has since 1995 operated a highly successful cap-and-trade program to limit emissions of sulfur dioxide, not a greenhouse gas, but a pollutant that causes acid rain. The acid rain program has been successful largely because regulated entities are required to routinely monitor, report, and verify emissions. On the other hand, as we reported in November 2008, the European trading scheme has been less successful largely because of a lack of quality emissions data, causing an inaccurate allocation of allowances in the beginning and the price of a ton of carbon to plummet to zero. It is important to note that the EU program is attempting to regulate only one greenhouse gas, carbon dioxide, in only one industry sector, the power sector. Data on emissions for other greenhouse gases in sectors such as methane from landfills, nitrous oxide from agricultural operations is far less refined than that for carbon dioxide. Determining emissions of these gases will be more challenging due to limited historical monitoring and a lack of reliable emissions factors. Nevertheless, comprehensive, reliable emissions data for all greenhouse gases and all sectors will be essential for any market-based mitigation scheme, whether cap and trade or tax, currently being debated in the Congress. There are some existing emissions inventories and registries, and you'll hear about some today, that provides a starting point for understanding the challenges in establishing baselines and tracking emissions over time. For example, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency maintains an official U.S. emissions inventory to meet our commitments to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, but this inventory uses models to estimate emissions at the national and industry sector level and would not be suitable for a downstream cap-and-trade system. Several private and nonprofit efforts also provide data collection services. For example, the World Resources Institute Greenhouse Gas Protocol is a widely used international accounting system for quantifying and managing greenhouse gas emissions, and it's developed accounting and reporting standards that are compatible with most inventory programs. In addition, the Climate Registry that you'll hear about next includes standards for emissions monitoring and for reporting those emissions through its website. The Chicago Climate Exchange also has an emissions reduction and trading scheme and requires its participants to use specific protocols to establish emissions baselines and track progress towards emissions reduction goals. but none of these inventories or registry is at the scope or complexity contemplated for a nationwide program. In conclusion, Mr. Chairman, we believe this hearing highlights a critical element of the climate change debate, the need to develop high-quality emissions baselines for all greenhouse gases and all sectors, and the ability to monitor, report, and verify future emissions against those baselines. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That concludes my statement. I'll be happy to answer questions at the appropriate time.
Good morning, Chairman Barrett and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today. As an organization committed to the accurate and transparent reporting and verification of greenhouse gas emissions, the Climate Registry is pleased to brief the subcommittee on these important topics. First, I'd like to provide a bit of background on the Climate Registry. The Registry is a nonprofit organization created in a collaborative effort by North American states, provinces, territories, and native sovereign nations. The Registry is governed by a unique board of directors, which today consists of representatives from 41 U.S. states and the District of Columbia, 12 Canadian provinces and territories, 6 Mexican states, and 4 native sovereign nations. In the map that's projected before you, the participating jurisdictions are highlighted in green. The concept of the registry took shape as states became increasingly interested in taking progressive action on climate change. They realized the opportunity to collaborate with one another to create a unified North American greenhouse gas registry. As a result, the registry's mission is to set consistent and transparent standards to calculate, verify, and publicly report greenhouse gas emissions into a single North American registry. The registry supports both voluntary and mandatory greenhouse gas programs and provides comprehensive data to promote the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. To date, the registry has more than 320 members representing large Fortune 500 companies, electric utilities, municipalities, colleges and universities, government agencies, and small businesses. The Registry's voluntary greenhouse gas reporting program is a rigorous initiative that requires its members to report their corporate-wide emissions of all 6 Kyoto gases from their operations throughout North America annually at the facility level. This program is based on 2 important international greenhouse gas accounting standards, namely the World Resource Institute World Business Council for Sustainable Development's Greenhouse Gas Protocol and the International Standard for Greenhouse Gas Accounting, ISO 14064 Part 1. These standards are compatible and complementary and have become the foundation for greenhouse gas accounting globally. The Registry's General Reporting Protocol, or GRP, builds upon these standards and provides specific direction on how to assemble greenhouse gas inventories and answers common questions such as, how do I report leased vehicles? Who reports if there are multiple owners of a facility? And how do I treat acquisitions? It is important to note that greenhouse gas reporting is substantially different from reporting criteria pollutants, which typically can be measured from smokestacks, since greenhouse gas emissions are ubiquitous and come from both large and small sources. One of the most important aspects of the Registry's voluntary program is its requirement of annual third-party verification. Verification is a systematic, independent, and documented process for evaluating the emissions report against agreed-upon criteria. But verification is similar to an audit of financial statements. It is an external attestation to the quality and accuracy of the reported information, and it creates confidence in the data that the data is accurate. The Registry's verification and accreditation programs are also based on international standards and are explained in more detail in my written testimony. Thus far, my testimony is focused on the Registry's voluntary program. However, the Registry supports both voluntary and mandatory greenhouse gas reporting programs. Many of the states and provinces comprising the Registry's Board of Directors have adopted or are in the process of adopting mandatory greenhouse gas initiatives, either individually or as part of regional initiatives. The Registry is currently working with over 20 jurisdictions, including the states and provinces participating in the Western Climate Initiative and the Midwestern Greenhouse Gas Reduction Accord, to develop a common greenhouse gas data collection platform to serve mandatory programs across North America. At the federal level, the Registry's Board of Directors recently adopted a policy statement to articulate the role it seeks for the Registry within a federal greenhouse gas reporting program. This statement is also included in my written testimony. In their statement, the Board of Directors expressed their desire for the Registry to be viewed as a model and a resource to support federal greenhouse gas registries. The subcommittee asked me to speak on the challenges and opportunities associated with tracking greenhouse gas emissions accurately. Before I do, I want to stress the fact that it is indeed possible for most organizations to accurately account for, report, and verify their emissions today. That said, there are challenges to reporting, and they tend to fall in two categories: organizational challenges and scientific uncertainty. Organizational challenges generally occur due to a lack of management systems specifically designed for greenhouse gas data collection. Since greenhouse gases have not been regulated before, many organizations do not have systems in place to monitor and track these emissions. Scientific uncertainty presents additional challenges to obtaining high-quality data. Quantification methods for certain sources of emissions either do not exist or contain high degrees of uncertainty. My written testimony describes specific areas of scientific uncertainty, the most notable of which is the quantification of fugitive emissions of methane. In terms of opportunities to improve the accuracy in greenhouse gas reporting, our recommendations include updating emission factors and quantification methods in a timely fashion, developing industry-specific protocols, and improving measurement technologies. To conclude, the registry was created to help organizations answer the very question posed by this hearing today: how do we know what we're emitting? Given the recent leadership of individual states and regions, the U.S. is well positioned to think about emissions beyond the traditional smokestack approach and to work across state and federal jurisdictional lines to begin to tackle climate change in a new and collaborative way, and the registry is uniquely positioned to help. We look forward to partnering with the federal government to serve a larger role in supporting national and North American greenhouse gas initiatives. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you have.
Chairman Baird, Ranking Member Ellis, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about Waste Management's greenhouse gas programs. Waste Management is the leading provider of waste management, recycling, and environmental services in North America. We also produce renewable waste-based energy, enough now to power over 1 million homes a year. Waste Management has chosen to voluntarily participate in greenhouse gas inventory and reduction efforts since 2004, both to achieve our own sustainability goals and to help our customers achieve their goals. It's important to note, however, that the waste sector is a very small contributor to U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. It's less than 3%. And through advancing technology, environmental regulation, and recycling, we have decreased greenhouse gas emissions by more than 75% in the past decade, despite a twofold increase in waste generation during that time period. In addition, EPA's 2008 greenhouse gas inventory found that landfill methane emissions have decreased by more than 16% since 1990. We're a big organization to inventory. We have about 2,500 sites in 48 U.S. states and Canada. We have recycling facilities, transfer stations, clean energy power plants, hauling companies with over 22,000 vehicles, and about 300 active and closed landfills. Our primary greenhouse gas emissions include direct carbon dioxide from using fossil fuel in vehicles and facilities, direct carbon dioxide emissions from the non-biogenic portion of the waste combusted in our waste-to-energy plants, indirect greenhouse gas emissions from the use of electricity, direct emissions of HFCs, PFCs, and sulfur hexafluoride in de minimis amounts, and finally, direct methane and carbon dioxide emissions from landfills. This includes fugitive and combustion emissions from landfill gas, which is itself approximately half carbon dioxide and half methane. We are already working to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions by tripling our recycling volume by 2020, by investing in innovative technology for landfill fleet management, and doubling our renewable power production by 2020. To complement our greenhouse gas reduction efforts, we have participated in 2 voluntary greenhouse gas management programs, and we're now undertaking a voluntary greenhouse gas footprint of our own development. Waste Management is a founding member of the Chicago Climate Exchange and was the first solid waste company to join. Since 2004, we're on track to meet our membership commitment of a 6% reduction from our CCX baseline by 2010. As a CCX member, we prepare a third-party verified annual inventory of carbon dioxide from fuel combustion and from waste combustion at our wholly owned waste-to-energy facilities. Then, in 2006, Waste Management was the first solid waste company to join the California Climate Action Registry, known as CCAR. We report direct carbon dioxide emissions from fuel consumption, indirect carbon dioxide emissions from electricity use, and these are also third-party verified reports. We also opted to report greenhouse gas emissions from landfills to pilot a landfill greenhouse gas inventory tool called the Solid Waste Industry for Climate Solutions, or SWICS protocol. The protocol greatly enhances currently available gas generation models that rely on default values by replacing that with measured data. This protocol also recognizes carbon sequestration, where the anaerobic conditions of a modern landfill allow significant amounts of biogenic material to not degrade. Once CCX and CCAR got us started, we launched a 2-year project to inventory our company-wide emissions using 2009 data to report in 2010. The Waste Management Carbon Footprint Project team has so far identified all of our sources, identified or developed emission calculation protocols, and developed a software tool for collecting verifiable data from the field. The next step is data collection, and then comes actual reporting. Our data will be auditable to support third-party verification, but we have recommended to EPA that third-party verification is unnecessary in a mandatory federal reporting program. There's no precedent for third-party verification in any federal environmental statute under which we operate. The protocols we are using at other than landfills were developed by the Climate Registry in conjunction with CCAR. But to calculate landfill emissions, we will use our SWICS protocol because it reflects the most sophisticated means of landfill assessment currently available through peer-reviewed science. However, estimation of fugitive landfill emissions is still a work in progress. A broadly accepted protocol does not exist. However, Waste Management, with other industry and academic leaders and EPA, is now conducting tests to measure landfill gas emissions under a variety of conditions, and this is detailed in our written testimony. We have urged the agency to consider waiting until the results of this research can be used to further refine greenhouse gas emission estimation before requiring landfills to report site-specific greenhouse gas emissions. In our greenhouse gas inventory efforts, Waste Management has learned that developing a proper program takes significant time. We believe a phased approach that allows reporting for a limited range of greenhouse gases or a limited set of sources for the first 2 to 3 years is essential. We recommend that a federal reporting program provide a transition period and exclude sources for which there is not an approved emission calculation protocol until such time that one is adopted. Thank you for the opportunity to present this information, and I'll be ready to answer questions when you are. Thanks.
Thank you, Chairman Barrett and members of the subcommittee. I appreciate the opportunity to speak on this topic. With greenhouse gas offset programs trading in markets such as the Chicago Climate Exchange, and with companies publicly reporting their greenhouse gas emissions inventories in programs such as the Climate Registry, the consequences of error and opportunity for fraud are high. The protection against this is the requirement that disinterested third parties such as Advanced Waste Management Systems, or AWMS, provide a verification that the reported values are accurate and complete. The ISO 14064 Part 3 and ISO 14065 International Organization for Standardization standards are the accepted rules for conducting greenhouse gas verifications in the U.S. and the world. These are the standards utilized for obtaining accreditation to perform verifications for entities such as the Climate Registry and the Chicago Climate Exchange. Both of these organizations have tasked the American National Standards Institute, ANSI, with accreditation of these verifiers. Using these ISO standards and the protocols of the specific program, ANSI conducts a thorough audit of the verifier to ensure appropriate technical knowledge, auditing skills, knowledge of the appropriate protocols, and implementation of a management system capable of providing consistent work product. This accreditation process entails both witnessing of actual verification work and of the verifier's management structure. AWMS successfully completed the accreditation process and is now one of 6 companies accredited to perform verification for the Climate Registry. We're also accredited to perform verifications for the Chicago Climate Exchange. The process for performing greenhouse gas verification varies slightly depending on the program, but the need for certainty of the reported data is so great that any greenhouse gas verification is conducted in a very consistent and rigorous fashion. The verification process essentially is a complete deconstruction of a company's inventory data. The initial data analysis is performed remotely using supplied information such as internal tracking spreadsheets, monitoring reports, fuel usage receipts, etc. The verifier uses this hard data to ensure appropriate application of emissions factors and usage of correct equations when generating the inventory or offset amount. Along with this more technical analysis comes simple analysis, such as looking for transcription errors, data entry errors, things like that. The completed data analysis serves as the basis for a risk assessment approach for on-site activities. Those areas of the company's inventory judged to be a greatest risk of error or material impact to the inventory are scheduled for detailed analysis by an on-site verification team. On-site data or on-site activities focus on where the data originated. Examples include verification of monitoring equipment, maintenance and calibration, verification that all emissions points are included in the inventory, and interviews with those responsible for collecting that data. The final step in the verification process is a technical review by another verifier from within the verification body. This is an additional complete verification, with the exception being that the observations of the on-site verification team are used rather than adding additional on-site burden. To conclude, I would like to emphasize the importance of the conflict of interest component to any verification program. The inherent risk of performing verification of consulting work that one's own company has conducted presents a conflict of interest that jeopardizes any greenhouse gas inventory or offset program. Such programs must protect against verification bodies hiding consulting work behind false or weak corporate separations. Additionally, relationships in which one verifies another's consulting work, if the favor is returned, must be watched for. Advanced Waste Management Systems, for example, performs no consulting activity of any kind. Thank you very much, and I look forward to answering any questions.
I thank all the witnesses for very informative testimony. One of the things that strikes me about this process is it is extraordinarily complex, and my own perspectives, I think, similar to what Mr. Inglis alluded to earlier. It seems to me on the carbon front, in terms of the mass production, it might just be easier to go upstream and say, well, let's just tax a ton of coal or a barrel of oil and figure, well, somewhere downstream we're taking care of that, taking care of the CO2 output from that. But at the same time, I think the testimony we've heard from Waste Management, from Ms. Gravender, suggests that there is a need, particularly if you look at things like methane sources from agriculture and other things that are not so easily captured up front. I wonder if you could share with us the sort of pros and cons of the upstream versus downstream analysis and monitoring, and also carbon versus other non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions.
Are you directing that at me?
Yeah, well, just the whole panel.
I would say you're right. Much more is known about carbon emissions right now than probably any of the other greenhouse gases. And because of the acid rain program, you do have in-stack monitoring for about 50% of the emitting sources of carbon dioxide. That's not true. Methane probably. Methane capture from landfills and so forth. That's probably not as much known, but there's a lot of progress, as you've heard, on working on factors and so forth to estimate those. Nitrous oxide is even more difficult to estimate because it comes from farming and tilling soil. And how are you going to assign an emissions baseline to farms, and how are you going to monitor that? So And in general, I think upstream is easier just because of the number of entities. The further upstream you go, the easier it is because of quantities. The easier it is to regulate, and it is a math problem, as Congressman Baird said, to estimate how much a ton of anthracite coal, for example, would result in a ton of emissions of carbon. So a lot of that can be done and can be estimated at that high level. So
Let's hear from some of our other witnesses about this issue.
I think it's a very interesting observation. While the goal for greenhouse gas emissions is for reductions, there are different perspectives if you're talking about a downstream corporate-wide inventory versus an upstream inventory. And I think that from the climate registry, we've really understood the benefit of having that corporate-wide footprint. It gives companies an opportunity to manage their emissions, because, as we like to say, you can't manage what you don't measure. And so if you don't have a clear understanding of your own corporate footprint, it's difficult to make those reductions. While it may be easier to regulate upstream, there is still value in having a corporate inventory, and many of our companies have benefited from that, not only for reducing their own emissions, but also for understanding policies that the federal government might take on in the future.
Mm-hmm. Ms. Wong?
You could say that my business is the ultimate end of the stream for many products. But what I would like to add to this statement is that life cycle assessment is extremely important. What we need to do is determine the life cycle carbon emissions of a whole host of products and services, and then start thinking about who needs to do the inventory, who needs to do the reductions. You have to have a place to start, and that's the life cycle inventory.
Good point. Mr. Ellis, any comment on this?
Sure. I would just like to add that I think the downstream program encourages forward thinking. For example, the founding reporters to the climate registry are very forward thinking. They're taking ownership of their inventory, and oftentimes by the time they've called upon us as a verifier and we get there, they have already acted to reduce that footprint and reduce that inventory. And I think that that's something that's important to keep in mind when you talk about downstream reporting at the entity level.
As we look towards Copenhagen, one of my problems with this approach is I see the urgency as much greater than the bureaucracy's pace, and my fear is, as I listen to all the good work that's been done, that's encouraging. My own belief is we ought to set a 350 part per million standard at Kyoto or at Copenhagen, and we're already above that, and that means dramatic reductions worldwide, particularly in our own country. And my fear, to be honest, is that we will spend a lot of time, because of the complexities of this issue, not agreeing on monitoring and thereby not reducing carbon. If you had to estimate, what do you think the likelihood is that we could, that something coming out of Copenhagen could say, well, okay, we're going to agree on this mechanism and this is how we'll monitor it? What do you think the likelihood is that we get to that agreement? And maybe that's not going to be the goal of Copenhagen, but at some point, if you're going to reduce, you're going to have some kind of monitoring.
what are you asking, whether we'll reach an agreement on that or whether it's...
Well, if you were to say, let me say it this way, if you were to get some of the top experts, yourselves and some other folks in the room, and say, look, we have to come up with a monitoring system in order, whether or not we establish cap and trade. But just set aside the cap and trade side, set aside a carbon tax, just an agreed upon monitoring system, and set aside Copenhagen. Just y'all get together with some other experts from around the world. What do you think it would take us to get to an agreed upon system?
For carbon or for all fixed greenhouse gases?
Or parse it out if you want.
It's probably possible, and the estimating techniques for carbon are better than the other greenhouse gases, so it's probably possible to get an emissions baseline that's pretty reliable. But the framework for estimating and therefore monitoring or establishing a baselines get more complex for the other gases. And yeah, 85% of the greenhouse gases are carbon, but in terms of potential warming potential, methane and nitrous oxide are much more potent than carbon, so you can't exclude those other gases. So I think there's a lot of work to be done on just the estimating techniques, the metrics that you use and everything else to be able to reliably estimate a baseline nationwide. It's going to be very difficult and time consuming.
My sense is that we will come out of Copenhagen with with at least a rigorous agreement. And I think if we take the opportunity to look at something like the climate registry, which wherein companies are actually reporting their greenhouse gas emissions, and the majority of those emissions, say from stationary combustion or mobile combustion, are in fact easily quantifiable and verifiable. There's certainly some accuracy issues associated with some of the other Kyoto gases, but I think the first step is saying, let's do this. And try to do it, and perhaps give some flexibility on some of those gases where there isn't as much accuracy out there, but at least learn from that process and evaluate that over time to see where really the scientific accuracy is needed, and how we can focus in on those areas to have a greater confidence in those additional gases. But I do think that we should and we need to take that step forward, and many of the emissions are able to be quantified and measured at this point.
That's encouraging. My time's expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I'd like to ask an open-ended question, but I think my question is coming far enough out of left field that I need to describe it a little bit again. What I'm looking for is your expertise on monitoring systems and figuring out what body of knowledge out there that might be applied to answering this question. And I realize this sort of ways and means question, but if you want to be in compliance with WTO, you got to figure out a way to not discriminate against imported goods. But at the same time, we don't want them to get a freebie in the air. So what we want to potentially do is, if you do this carbon tax, revenue neutral carbon tax, you can apply it within the domestic market, and that can be removed as a value-added tax can be removed when it hits international commerce. So you apply it domestically, and then you can remove it at the border when you're shipping out. Of course, when it gets to another country, they can apply it there. And so what we would like to do is say goods coming in get subject to the exact same regime that we've got. But figuring out how to somehow take a shot at the measurement of what it is. We go with an upstream application of the revenue neutral carbon tax, which seems most reasonable administratively in this country. The question is, how could you compare that to what China's carbon footprint might be in the materials that are being imported? One possibility is to say that here's the average carbon content in American steel, and that would be determined by figuring out all the inputs into that steel, and then apply the same tax to imported steel. Now, in some countries, in France, they might want an adjustment because they'd say, listen, we got a lot of nuclear, we would like to appeal for a lower assessment. In China, it's basically giving them a freebie because they're using dirtier technology and dirtier coal, right? But you have any ideas about how to help me out with measuring so that you can have an efficient, streamlined process of applying a domestic standard to internationally produced goods? Anybody want to take a shot at that?
Thank you.
Ms. Wong.
If I may, I don't know that what you really need is a way to calculate emissions from activities in other countries, but to have a base data collection effort in what different types of manufacturing activities emit, have them agreed upon at the international level, and be able to apply them to products. For example, if you use nuclear-based energy to produce a product, it's going to have a lower carbon footprint than a high-sulfur coal with no scrubbers.
Right.
Now, it would be a huge undertaking, and it would have to be agreed upon on an international basis in order to be applied internationally. But if the different countries could come together and agree to certain footprints for certain activities, they could be applied to a manufacturing process to come up with a life cycle.
Mm-hmm. Anybody else want to take a shot at that?
I would just say that let's take imports from China. Determining their carbon footprint and what kinds of inventory estimating techniques they use, and having to verify and monitor that is going to be very problematic. I don't know whether you could estimate
Yes, in fact,
estimate the carbon footprint for a like U.S. product, maybe, and apply that to the import.
that's exactly what we're thinking about doing.
And it would be much easier at the commodity level, like the example you gave on steel, than it would at the end product level, I would think.
Right.
So,
What you're looking for really is some mathematical system.
Yes.
That you can sort of take a guess.
For all kinds of products,
Wouldn't be exact, but it would be somewhere in the ballpark. And it's important that it not be discriminatory. It can't hurt imports more than it is applied to domestic produced goods.
GAO does have some ongoing work right now for Senate Finance looking at revenue generation from climate change, and we're getting into this issue a little bit.
Speaking of which, that's another question I have. I got a little bit of time left. Is who's best to develop monitoring standards? What's the agency that's best to do that? If we go into either cap and trade or carbon tax, revenue to carbon tax, is it NIST or is it EPA or is it somebody else?
Well, right now EPA is the one that estimates emissions inventories for Kyoto, so for the framework convention, I should say. So they have probably a jump start on other agencies, but Department of Energy also has a lot of information on estimating techniques.
And what I've been asking about here, do you think that's still within the EPA? Is it that's where it's logical, or where is it somewhere else?
Probably, I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
Yeah. There may be
doesn't seem like EPA is a fit for that.
Right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Lujan.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. And first and foremost, thank you for holding this hearing. This is a very important issue as we look at what's happening around the country, but around the world, especially as we move forward to continue to create the jobs that we need to be able to get the country moving in the right direction, to be able to be smarter about the way that we're developing technologies and moving industry forward, but also in the way that we're going to be generating electricity, power, looking to power our vehicles in this country, and the amount of waste. Mr. Chairman, we recently had a hearing on the importance of recycling waste when it comes to technology with computers, cell phones, and what we need to be looking at and how we're going to evaluate how we can move forward into the future. Not only are we going to be able to monitor the amount of greenhouse gases, Mr. Chairman, that are moving forward, but we're also going to possibly create some job opportunities as a result of moving forward and monitoring. And so, Mr. Chairman, my questions stem mainly from the coordination, carrying on from the line of question we just had, but from a coordination perspective, how will the Climate Registry be able to coordinate with the EPA and the states, those states that have moved forward? I'm proud to say, Mr. Chairman, New Mexico is one of the first states to adopt a mandatory greenhouse gas reporting program. And so how do you envision that coordination, anyone that may want to take that?
Ms. Gravender?
Thank you very much for the question. It's an important one. The Climate Registry has been interacting with US EPA, has been in conversations with them. They're certainly aware of our protocols, the work that we've done. While we haven't seen the mandatory rule yet that they are about to release on greenhouse gas emissions, we hope that it will contain be derived from much of the information that we've worked on so far. In our written testimony, we do have a statement from our board of directors that stipulates that at a minimum every federal greenhouse gas reporting program should utilize the greenhouse gas calculation and accounting methods that are consistent with the Climate Registry. allow states and provinces to collect data for federal programs, and maintain the state's abilities to collect additional information if they'd like. So we feel that there's a lot of opportunity for collaboration, both on the policy side and also from a data collection standpoint. The registry has a number of sophisticated programs that we feel would be useful to implementing some type of a federal greenhouse gas registry.
Mr. Chairman, anyone else?
I just chime in on the verification side of things and point to the work that ANSI has done to coordinate that side of the house and ensure that there's consistency in verification activities. And the easy example to point to is the ISO 14065 and ISO 14064-3 that are internationally recognized standards for performing verification. So as a verifier, having gone through the ANSI accreditation process, we're confident that we can operate on an international scale. And programs such as the Climate Registry and the Chicago Climate Exchange both point to that ANSI accreditation process as being a requirement. So on the verification side, I can say there's definitely a very good level of harmonization and consistency, which is critical to any program, I think.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, a follow-up, Mr. Ellis. You state that the Climate Registry permits the use of estimation of techniques of up to 5% of their total inventory. Is it possible that some entity could calculate big greenhouse gas reductions under the 5% rule without actually achieving the greenhouse gas reductions?
There's simplified techniques. I suppose it's possible that they could wedge something into that 5%, but I think it's unlikely. These tend to fall out to things like, the chairman's vehicle that he didn't keep good fuel receipts on or something like that, that they can't really wrap their hands around, but they need to acknowledge it's there. And I think you're unlikely to see some large-scale program revolving around the sales department's company vehicle or something along those lines. So I would say it's very unlikely.
And Mr. Chairman, lastly, what I would just like to encourage is that we do reach out to public utility commissioners around the country. I can tell you as a former public utility commissioner, the work that's being done, especially my familiarity with this in Western states is somewhere where I know that we could probably lean on getting some additional expertise or help in coordinating those efforts at that level, Mr. Chairman. And again, thank you for holding this hearing. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Lujan, and you bring great expertise in that area, and thank you for that. Mr. Bartlett. Dr. Bartlett.
Thank you very much. Isn't it true that water vapor is far and away the largest greenhouse gas? I think that is true. And if that's true, then if the emission of other greenhouse gases increases the temperature of the Earth, should we not have more water vapor? Which would then start a self-enforcing cycle: more water vapor, warmer Earth; more water vapor, warmer Earth. If this is true, then shouldn't we be in a position to measure globally water vapor so that we could see if this vicious cycle was starting? Is there any focus on that at all? But it would seem a priori that if water vapor is the largest greenhouse gas, and I think it is, that if the other greenhouse gases increase global temperature, that would mean there would be more water vapor, which would mean more global warming. So this should start. Obviously, we're in balance now and have been for a long time. But if we tip that balance, might not some pretty evil things happen? Methane is what, 20 times more effective than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. What is do we know the total contribution of those two presently to as greenhouse gases? Less methane, but 20 times more effective.
Well,
which is the largest contributor now?
Well, right now, methane's about 6% of the total greenhouse gas, but if you applied a factor that you're
20.
talking about, we haven't done the math, but you could do that.
Yeah.
In other words, 1 ton of methane is probably worth 21 tons of carbon.
Yeah.
And it gets even higher for nitrous oxide, which is 300 times more potent than carbon
Yes,
dioxide.
but a whole lot less of it. Now, we're focusing
Right.
on landfills for methane, but my understanding is that the cattle on the Earth may produce more methane, may produce more effective global warming than all the cars in all the world. Now, if that's true, why shouldn't we have a focus on having less animals? We'd be healthier, by the way. the meat people bribed the nutritionists to lie about food groups, and we now have a meat food group and a dairy food group, and they are not different. As a matter of fact, the best proteins in all the world come from the dairy group. Milk protein is the best protein in the world. Eggs are the second best. If you assign a value of 100 to milk, eggs are about 96, and meat started to low 90s and go on down. So why shouldn't we have a focus? We're really worried about global warming. Why shouldn't we have a focus on having less animals? That would mean more vegetarians and longer life for all of us.
I guess it has to be implementable. And the public hasn't shown its desire to give up meat.
Well, you know, I think that education is a big part of this. The American people need to know that the proteins they get from dairy products are far superior to the proteins they get from meat. And they need to know that the proteins produced by dairy products require, about 1/10 to 1/20th of the amount of feed that it requires to produce meat. Pork and chicken people brag that they get 3 pounds of pig for 1 pound of food. But that's 3 pounds of wet pig, 70% water, and you can't eat the bones, to 1 pound of grain, which is about 90% dry matter. So on a dry matter basis, it's at least 10 to 1 for the pig and the chicken, and maybe 20 to 1 for the steer. If you have a milk cow who will produce 20,000 pounds of milk in a year, a ton of dry matter in a year, with little more feed than the steer would eat, by the way, and at the end of the year, you still got the cow to eat if you want. So if we're really concerned about global warming, why shouldn't we be focusing on methane? And, you know, if most of our people became vegetarians, it would make a far greater contribution to reducing greenhouse gases than every one of us driving a Prius. Isn't that true?
I suppose we should strive to reduce all forms of greenhouse gas.
But, you know, this one is particularly important because not only are you reducing greenhouse gases, you're improving your health. So why shouldn't there be a focus on that?
I can't answer that. You're the policy making body.
We have an education program which you all could contribute to in informing the American people. You don't have to eat meat to get good protein. When you eat meat, you are really contributing to greenhouse warming because methane is 20 times more potent than CO2. And again, back to one of the original statements I made, and my understanding is that cows in the world produce more potential global warming than all the cars in all the world. Now, if that's true, don't you think it would be advantageous if more of our people knew that?
Dr. Bartlett, could we ask perhaps Ms. Gravender? I'm very intrigued by the line of questioning. I wonder if Ms. Gravender in her work in carbon registry or greenhouse gas registries has evaluated methane output from feedlots, for example, or from animals. Maybe you can give us some data on that. Maybe not.
At this point, we have not looked at methane emissions from animals. That said, I do know that the California Climate Action Registry does have a methane. They're working on methane digesters, which in part is capturing some of the emission from animals as an emission reduction project. So there has been some work that's been done on this. Otherwise, I'd say that I do think overall the public opinion is beginning to become interested in eating locally, if you will, to reduce the transportation associated and the emissions associated with transporting food and the emissions that result from that. So I do think that there is an increasing awareness of greenhouse gas emissions overall and our own personal impact on those emissions.
Local variants, I think you call them, don't they? People that eat
That's correct.
no more than 300 miles from home.
That's correct.
Thank you much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Dr. Bartlett, for always an interesting approach and I think an innovative and important line of questioning. Dr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It certainly, Dr. Bartlett has my mind thinking along different lines now. But the question that I really wanted to put forward, and I'm here, and I thank the chairman and also the ranking member for having this hearing. Just trying to understand and get a better handle on. We hear so much talk about cap and trade or a carbon tax, and I have I'm an engineer, and I always want to know how do I measure that. So I just want to start with Ms. Wong, and then anyone else who wants to also chime in here. What are the differences between the Chicago Climate Exchange and the Climate Registry protocols? I'm just trying to get a handle on that for myself, the differences in those protocols.
That's a good question. To begin with, the Chicago Climate Exchange is an actual trading system. It's a cap and trade system that enforces reductions on its members. Of course, membership is voluntary, and the credits that are generated within the system can be traded among members. But the other one you asked about was not the Climate Registry, but the California Climate.
No, the Climate Registry.
The Climate Registry is a set of protocols. It is not, they do not have their own carbon credits or trading process. It's a means of developing an inventory. It's a collection of protocols, calculations, scientific information, guidelines. They publish some guidelines for data collection also. They're very different. One is an organization in and of itself. The other is an aid to developing an inventory.
Well, how does the CSX, how is that measured? You know, when you're trading, you have to have some sort of measurement of what you're trading.
Yes, sir. They do have their own protocols as well. And sometimes they borrow from other established protocols.
I think the Chicago Climate Exchange uses the World Resource Institute protocols to baseline, but we have the Climate Registry expert right next to me.
One of the main differences is that the Chicago Climate Exchange is focused on emission reduction projects.
Right.
So you're taking a baseline and then you're measuring the activity in addition to that baseline in order to quantify an emission reduction. The Climate Registry, conversely, is talking about putting together a corporate-wide inventory. So that's the primary difference between the two activities. One is emission reductions that are then traded on the market, and the other is a corporate-wide inventory.
I would point out, too, from the verification side, the Chicago Climate Exchange is a bit more prescriptive in the things that we need to look for. For example, quarterly monitoring as opposed to just routine monitoring, that sort of thing for methane content in the landfill sector, for example. So there's a bit of a difference in the verification side of thing, which is natural since you're talking about dollars and cents on the Chicago Climate Exchange. The need for absolute verification is a little bit more important when you insert money.
But does if you compare the measurements, and I know you're starting with a different, you have the baseline there, and I know you're talking about reductions with the CSX is what the interest is. But if you compared the Climate Registry and what the measurements there and the measurements, the CSX, are they close? Is there a real comparison there? Has there been a comparison of that?
Well, again, they're measuring different things, so it's difficult to do a parallel comparison in some regard. Also, the Chicago Climate Exchange is a private operation, whereas the California the Climate Registry is a public endeavor. So all of our protocols are vetted publicly with public comment periods. The Chicago Climate Exchange developed their protocols without that public feedback. So there is still a private and public difference between the two as well.
So do we not know what exactly the Chicago Climate Exchange, what their other measurements are?
Well, I will say that the Chicago Climate Exchange, the protocols are only available to those who participate, so they are not available for public consumption for us to do that assessment.
But right now, the baseline estimating techniques are not the same, and that's the point that you're making. I think that they need to be standardized for a nationwide system before it can work. There are lots of slightly different estimating techniques or protocols that you can use for various greenhouse gases.
Thank all of you for your testimony. Oh, Ms. Wong.
Just one small correction. Chicago Climate Exchange has posted their protocols on their website now. Oh. They were not available some time ago, but they have added them to their website. And if I may say, if you're looking to the underlying science, how do you calculate emissions from a typical process? They're going to be very, very similar. They just use the data in different ways.
Okay. Thank you.
We'll do another round of questions. This is a fascinating discussion. Well, I'm intrigued. Someone maybe Ms. Wong or others acknowledge the importance of life cycle estimation. We had some folks from the forestry groups in yesterday, and they explained they had some frustration that, and I'm not sure this is correct, but they felt that LEED certification on environmentally friendly businesses was so focused on the sort of the R value, if you will, of the insulating value, that it didn't look at lifestyle, so that wood framed buildings could be rated lower, according to them, than steel or concrete, which strikes me in terms of my understanding of life cycle greenhouse and acidification gas profile. A wood building is a carbon sink, whereas burns a lot of fuel to make steel or concrete. The reason I ask that is, are we at a point, and what would it take to get to a point where I, as a consumer who cares about the environment, whether it's through my dietary habits or decisions about cars or drinking water out of a bottle, to where I could make an informed decision? You know, I can look on this, it's just water, but you can look on a bottle and say, okay, you've got, X amount of vitamin B, X amount of high fructose corn syrup, whatever. But I can't do anything like that easily to inform myself about the life cycle carbon footprint. Are we at where we could do that, where you could have a label that tells you the life cycle carbon footprint, and not just on a product you buy, but on a behavior you engage in?
If I could speak to that briefly, a lot of our activities that we've engaged in for sustainability purposes and greenhouse gas management purposes have been driven by our customers. Our customers have asked for it, and we have done the necessary research to supply them with the information they needed, either to conduct an activity or to measure the services we were providing for them. So, yes, if there were a system available where life cycle analyses were available, it would be very helpful. And it's occurring now. There's more information out there than you might think. Unfortunately, it's hidden in each individual company's website. It's not been compiled.
I believe the Carbon Trust in the UK has begun a program where they actually have an icon of a black footprint that is small or large as an indication of the emissions associated with producing that product. So I believe that we're starting to get to the point where consumer knowledge and consumer awareness is growing and is interested. In terms of the lifestyle, I'm not sure how that's going to transpire. The Climate Registry is considering taking on some of these issues of life cycle assessment within our voluntary registry, and we'll take all of your remarks into consideration.
One of the things that strikes me is, and you I'm sure all know this better than I, but if you were to make a presumption that there's no, that sort of a morality or philosophical basis, there's no reason that one person on planet Earth should be able to produce more greenhouse and ocean acidification gases than another, and yet I believe we're 20-some-fold greater than where we need to be in order to get lethal overheating of our planet and acidification where it needs to be. We need to dramatically reduce. And back to Dr. Bartlett's observation, I think there's a general sense that people feel like, well, we're entitled to a certain lifestyle. And I think the gentleman, Mr. Stephenson, said, people don't want to give up eating meat. Part of acting as a responsible person in a shared environment is you don't say, what do I want to do? You say, what is the right thing to do? What are the consequences of my action? And the reason I ask these questions is, how do we get to that? Well, I want to ask Mr. Ellis, you made an interesting observation. We've seen a financial meltdown because credit default swaps, nobody was paying attention. And because there were conflicts of interest with people reporting one thing even though they knew something else to be true because it was in their incentive to do so. As we look at a grand scheme of things, and as Mr. Inglis pointed out, we look at these fluctuations in the markets already in Europe. How do you get around that? If you come up with a complex cap and trade kind of system? How do we prevent it from market manipulation, dishonest numbers, et cetera, et cetera?
Well, I think the simple answer is third-party verification. And along with that, obviously needs to come a very strong management of that. And I think we can look to the Climate Registry as setting a good example in that regard. The amount of information that I as a verifier provide to them in order to be vetted, in order to even embark on a verification with one of their members, is very detailed. And just simply asking the question, I think, helps start that. For instance, no member of our staff that has more than $5,000 personal interest in a company can perform any sort of verification work for that company. The greatest risk I see, however, though, is like I mentioned in my written testimony and here today, is thinly veiled consulting and verification sides of the same company. I think that it's fairly easy to engineer something like that on paper to say, oh, you know, that's our consulting branch. They don't do any verification work. It's pretty easy to make it look that way on paper, but I think when you really get out there in the field, you can pierce a hole through that veil pretty easily. So that would be our biggest word of warning, and it's also why we as a business have made the absolute decision that we will not consult. It just introduces risk. I mean, even if I don't personally know the person that did the consulting work and I'm the verifier, if I still see my company logo on that report that I'm verifying, I'm going to feel some amount of pressure to reflect positively on that work product. So I think that the simple answer is a strong verification program will smoothen those market fluctuations because there's faith that that product actually exists, and especially when you're talking greenhouse gas that you can't see and hold.
Yeah. Ms. Wong?
If I could add to that, I think the key to the question was beginning with an extremely complex system. An extremely complex system with added complexity because third-party validation is added is not going to get us very far. What's going to get us to real reductions is a simple system that's predictable, that can be implemented quickly. You may not get all of the reductions you want immediately, but you will get some demonstrable reductions, and then you can take additional time to develop your program.
What about a hybrid where you encourage the voluntary self-monitored thing, and then there are adverse or positive consequences if the third party validates what you've done? In other words, if you get it right, you say, we've lowered it by 30%. These guys come along, lo and behold, you have lowered it by 30%, you get a fabulous prize. If you don't, you get a fabulous penalty.
There's a bit of that built into the Climate Registry right now, and that the baseline verification is much stronger. You're building a relationship between the verifier and the reporter and saying, okay, you have the internal management structure to understand your inventory and manage this program well. And then every annual subsequent verification can be ratcheted down a bit because you have faith in the system and you're just verifying the system's still in place, not necessarily every single work product of the system. So that has been acknowledged, I think, well by the Climate Registry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following up on that, maybe could you lead me through an example, Mr. Ellis, of how verification might work when in a particular business, let's say Waste Management has a site, how would you go about verifying their compliance with a cap and trade, a voluntary cap and trade? How does that work?
Sure. Well, for instance, in the Climate Registry, where it's a voluntary inventory program, it's a pretty simple flow chart, if you want to call it that, where initially we gather remotely all their data, as much as they can send us, and we take a representative sample, for example, electricity usage, say. We would look at their spreadsheet by which they tracked that electricity usage, and then we'd ask them to send us January's bills, and we look and learn how that interface happens. How did it get from the bill or the meter, whatever, to the spreadsheet? And we deconstruct every bit of that data and then rebuild it and see if we come up with the same numbers. And then that serves as a risk analysis to say, where is the most inherent risk? Where did they most likely miss a meter or, you know, document some information, something along those lines, and that's when we go on site and specifically target those high-risk areas and those areas that could most materially impact the verification. And that process holds true. I mean, just as an example of the range that we deal with is AWMS. We started, our first verification was a small-scale ski resort, and we embark next week on verification of one of the largest electricity generation, transmission, and distribution utilities in the United States. So that mechanism holds true across almost literally as wide of a range of spectrum as you could possibly imagine.
Yeah. In order to do the ski slope, do you have to have already done, though, the electric utility?
No, the protocols apply the same to each.
I guess what I'm asking is, the electric, how certain are you that the ski slope, the bill reflects the actual generation of the power? In other words, that they know how much was nuclear, how much was, I mean, is that easily discerned?
It is, absolutely. First we assess off-site whether the bills are accurately transcribed. I mean, you can have simple data transcription errors that lead to a material impact, but then the on-site, in their case, electricity was a huge component. It was the overwhelming component of their inventory. Right. So we literally said, okay, we're in this building, show me the meter, and make sure that meter marries up to what we physically see on site. So it can be physically verified, absolutely, and that's...
And Ms. Wong, you made a very important point earlier about this being simple to do, because we don't want to add a burden. If we can avoid the burden, we want to not add a burden. So you found it fairly easy to ferret out that information, or...?
It depends on the source. In the case of electrical utility usage, there are e-grid standards published putting a value on the typical carbon impact of electrical generation in a particular state. It averages in all the different sources, and you can use that as a default value. Or if you are buying exclusively from a utility that uses green energy, you can do your own formula from that utility. But using the e-grid numbers provides a pretty robust result.
Yeah, and electricity being really somewhat fungible, right? How certain are you that you can really track that? I mean, you feel comfortable with that? That if you're buying green energy, you really are buying green energy?
Well, we produce green energy, and the green energy we produce, we certainly validate as green energy. I don't think I can really speak to the subject of how to determine whether energy is green or not. But when you ask if I'm comfortable with the end result, yes, because an invoice is ultimately audited as part of your financial data. Chances are, if a company is paying an invoice, it's accurate. They're going to do something about it if they are overpaying, and the seller is going to do something about it if they're underpaying. So when you use an invoice as your core data source, it's inherently verifiable.
Do you want to add something to that? Anybody else?
Let me just add that, you mentioned the electricity grid is homogeneous. I mean, you can't tell whether your watt of electricity came from a nuclear plant or a wind farm or whatever, but you can allocate, if 20% of our energy comes from nuclear, you can allocate the carbon emissions based on a watt of electricity. So you couldn't say this guy was nuclear and he has a smaller carbon footprint than this guy who got it all from those high sulfur content coal or something.
Right. Helpful. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Edwards.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize I wasn't here earlier for your testimony, but I've looked at it, and I just have one question or set of questions for Ms. Gravender. Is that how you pronounce your name? Yes. Thank you. And it has to do with voluntary versus mandatory reporting and standards? Because I've had experience in dealing with companies reporting labor practices internationally, and there are many mixed messages about how and whether these kind of voluntary reporting systems can work when it essentially is sort of self-policing. And so I wonder if you could explore with me just for a bit about what kinds of incentives, or not really enforcement mechanisms, because it would be it's a voluntary program, but what kind of incentives can be in place that encourage companies to straightforwardly and accurately report, and then what's in it for them? I mean, I looked at in your testimony, and you indicated some of the reasons why folks would want to participate in a reporting program, but what's in it for them in the end? And then lastly, if you could talk to us about how one might make a transition from a voluntary system to a mandatory system, and then what are the sets of things that need to be in place in order to encourage compliance even in a mandatory system.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for your questions. I think the first thing to understand is that while the registry's voluntary program is voluntary in that you elect to participate, it is not in fact self-policing. We have third-party verifiers such as Advanced Waste Management who must review and attest to the quality of the data that is reported. So you can't voluntarily choose which emissions you're going to report. Rather, you voluntarily choose to participate in the program, and then the data that you report is reviewed by a third-party verification body annually. So that's a bit different. What's in it for companies? As we said earlier, companies cannot manage what they don't measure. So it's very valuable for organizations to understand their corporate-wide footprint so that they can identify where there are opportunities for reductions. That may lead to emission reduction projects that create financial value to them. It may also just be an inefficiency approach for them where they can identify pollution, if you will, that they can reduce and act more effectively. In terms of a transition from voluntary to mandatory, I think we're thinking of this from the mindset of most organizations will likely report mandatory emissions first. So I think it's sort of flipping the question, and how can mandatory data be then used in a voluntary world? Assuming a company is required to report to a mandatory program, that's likely going to be facilities that trigger a certain threshold of emissions, so they're largest sources of emissions. And then to supplement that for the full corporate footprint, if you will, can that data be the mandatory data be transferred into a more robust voluntary database, if you will, where the organization could round out the rest of their emissions footprint? That's how we're seeing the intersection between mandatory reporting, which will likely be at a certain thresholds, to voluntary reporting that will be more comprehensive in scope.
And then are there incentives in terms of a company's relationship to a consumer or client that would encourage greater participation?
I think some companies are more aware, more concerned about the public perception, and want to be seen as an environmentally progressive organization, or particularly concerned about their emissions footprint. So I think there's just a different risk assessment and interest in that from a corporate perspective.
I mean, if you look now, for example, at like LEED standards and LEED certification, I mean, there are developers out there who say they want that LEED certification. I mean, and we haven't really had to do very much to necessarily to require it, but it's become kind of an industry mantra. And I wonder if there's a similar application in the area of emissions.
Well, I think there's certainly the possibility. We've seen from the California Climate Action Registry, which was a voluntary registry, when the state of California implemented mandatory reporting, we thought this will be an interesting observation. Will those companies that signed up for a voluntary program drop off and just participate in the mandatory program, or will they maintain both? And what we've seen thus far, even though it's very early in the process, is that companies are staying in the voluntary registry because they derive value associated with that. So So we expect to see and hope to see a similar experience. It'll be very interesting to see how mandatory greenhouse gas emissions are required to be reported at the federal level, to see how organizations react to that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. I enjoy the waste management ads on television. They have such beautiful nature scenes. But every time I see that ad, I'm reminded, although burning that stuff is kind of green, that waste stream represents profligate use of fossil fuels, doesn't it? And so in an increasingly energy deficient world, there's going to be less and less of that waste stream. And wouldn't it be greener to not have used that stuff initially so that it doesn't end up in the landfill? That's just an observation. How close are we to being able to have truth in advertising? I'm not a big fan of government and government regulation, but I am a huge fan of truth in advertising and labeling. How close are we so that we can tell the consumer, and probably have to use something like CO2 equivalents, because that's what people are understanding about contribution to climate change and global warming. How close are we to telling the guy what this action will entail in terms of CO2 equivalent footprint? Like when you sit down to eat that big beefsteak, if big red letters on the menu, it told him that was going to have a bigger carbon footprint than driving his Explorer there to eat it. Don't you think we might have some change in behavior? Because I think most people are really concerned about this, but they're ignorant. They don't know what they're doing. How close are we that we can put down the global warming contribution of all of our actions and things we buy and so forth?
Well, sir, we have the technology now to obtain a carbon footprint of just about any activity you would like to footprint.
So why aren't we putting that down on the menu and on the gas pump and on your thermostat in your house? If you turn it up 2 degrees, what's that CO2 footprint? Why aren't we doing that? I think people would like to know the contributions they're making so they can use less destructive pursuits and products and so forth. Is that something we need to do, or is that something the industry can voluntarily? I'm not a big fan of Big Brother, by the way. I'd like industry to lead. Why doesn't industry lead in doing this?
Well, as an example, we have been engaged in greenhouse gas inventorying and reduction efforts since 2004. And it's still voluntary. We're still doing it, still advancing it. And we plan to disclose our company carbon footprint for 2009 and 2010.
But that's on a website somewhere. It's not on your electric bill. It's not on your menu. It's not listed on the products you buy in the grocery store. Everything we buy, everything we do, you just can't live and use energy without having a CO2 equivalent footprint, can you? Mm-hmm. Why aren't we being told what that is so that we can make wise choices? We have the capability to do it, don't we? Can we at least make a reasonable guesstimate as to the CO2 equivalent contribution of everything we buy and everything we do? Why wouldn't that be desirable to have that there so that people can see?
It would, but the quickest way to do it is to mandate it unless there's public pressure to have such information. That's usually the way it happens the quickest. There's a great demand from the public to have better information on the carbon footprint of everything they do. There are many websites that individuals can go on and estimate their own carbon footprint, for example. But how many people do you think do it? They just don't, for whatever reason.
But it's so easy to see it if it's on the gas pump, if it's on your menu, if it's on the box of Cheerios you buy. It's so easy to see it there. And I would just like to see it there. I would encourage industry to do this before government tells them to do it. You know, that just encourages government to get bigger. When industry doesn't do something and then they're forced to do it because we ask them to do it. I would hope that you would encourage the industries you all are associated with to start putting the CO2 equivalent carbon footprint on everything that you sell on all of our activities so that Americans know the contribution that they're making to potential global warming. I think most of us want to be responsible, but there's enormous ignorance out there about the consequences of our activities. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for a good hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Bartlett. I want to ask one. Do you want another round? I just want to talk a little bit briefly about how can we scale this up internationally? If we go to Copenhagen, or if we go to international cap and trade or something like, how capable are other countries of learning our way of exporting this? I mean, we don't have it yet in our own country, so it's presumptuous, I suppose, to assume we export it. But Ms. Wong asserts, and others seem to verify, that we can get a pretty good estimate of carbon footprint, and we seem to think that either with a combination of upstream or downstream, albeit with some imperfections, we might be able to get a pretty good sense. How do we scale this up globally?
Well, I think you've kind of answered your question in the asking. We do need to do a little more here before we can scale it up. And a good start is to provide a uniform base to do a small amount of reporting, a limited reporting scope, and then allow the states to enhance that to perhaps require more data or more intense data, and compile that to come up with our own carbon footprint, and then we can lead through example.
I would just say I think you need to start where the information is the best right now in carbon, and then work on the other greenhouse gases and increasing complexity as better information becomes available on the other gases.
And these are programs that have been operating at an international level a lot longer than we've been in the conversation. So as opposed to looking at it maybe as an export situation, we can pay attention to the import situation. There's a lot of good science and a lot of good real-life market experience out there. They've gone through a number of course corrections in the European Emissions Trading Scheme, and there are a number of other international trading schemes out there. So I think that the question also should include what can we import. It's a critical
Excellent
element.
point. And there are certain other manufacturers that are working on making electronics, automobiles, et cetera, far more recyclable than ours are. So it's a very, very good point. Mr. Inglis, did you have any additional questions? With that, then, I want to thank our witnesses for an outstanding and informative hearing today. The record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements for the members and for answers to any follow-up questions the committee may ask of witnesses. With that, the witnesses are excused, and the hearing is now adjourned. I thank the witnesses and all those in attendance today. Thank our panelists.